In this video, I'm going to talk about the 14th century rondeau, which was a type of secular form that was based on a poetic model. So this era in France was an era that concludes the medieval era, the bigger, overall period of music from basically 600 AD with the advent of Gregorian chant and notating those melodies through then the end of the 1300s and into the beginning of the 15th century. So this last century, the 14th century, is one that is described with the term ars nova, which means new art. So you may have seen this term before if you studied the early music history. In general, you think of the 12th and 13th centuries in France. Notre Dame School, and the two of the first that were not anonymous were Leoline and Perrotin. And you see the writing of polyphonic music in this era, at the beginning of the setting of the Mass, and also the beginning of the motet. So what we're going to look at with rondeau, though, occurs in this next little sub-era of the medieval, which is the ars nova. Philippe de Vitry is the theorist and composer who gave it this name, this new art. And one of the main things has to do with the subdivision of the main rhythmic unit, which was called the breve. And in earlier music, so pre-14th century, the breve was only subdivided into a triple. And that is something that was connected with theology and represents the Trinity in Christian theology. And so what we see here in the 14th century in France is that composers began to write works that divide the breve into parts of two, to the duple subdivision. So this work that we're going to look at, you'll see it is a contemporary performance edition of the work. And so you'll see that it has passages that it begins in triple, which is typical of that era, but then you're going to have some passages in duple. And so there's a lot of discussion about that. Some felt like it was heretical to do that, but one of the leading composers of the ars nova is the French composer Guillaume de Machaut. A-U-T. So Guillaume de Machaut. And Machaut was a poet and musician. He is the one who is noted for being the first to completely set all of the different portions of the ordinary of the Mass in his landmark work, the Misa de Notre Dame. But that, of course, is a sacred work. He wrote lots of secular works as well. And so that's where we're going to, look at this, particular type of secular work, which is called the rondeau. So, So that's his most famous work, which was the complete setting of the ordinary of the Mass. Those sections that were performed every week. All right. So the secular works that Machaut was writing in, and then other composers in the 14th century in France, were known as the fixed forms. And there are three of these types of fixed forms. And they are based on poetic structures. And they all have to do with the idea of a returning idea, whether it's a refrain or returning lines of text. And so we're going to see this returning lines of text in this particular one of the three fixed forms that's known as the rondeau. So these three were called the virelai, the rondeau, and the ballade. So they all feature So I'll put it, these are based on poetry, poetic models, on how they were organized. Okay, so three of these in total. So the one we're going to look at is the rondeau. And if you will go online to, if you'll just refer to the website and go to Handout and Scores, and then if you will slide down to rondeau and then across to the right to Score for 14th century rondeau and click on that, then what you'll see is then when you download that file, an example of a 14th century rondeau. It says late 14th century. This is from the Historical Anthology of Music, Ham. And it is a work that's attributed to Soulage, who's another French 14th century composer. And the name of this poem upon which this musical setting is based is called, and that is going to translate as Smoky Fumes. So it is an esoteric text for sure. But what I want you to do is to look at a couple of things here at the beginning of the work musically. And so as I mentioned earlier, it is a contemporary performance edition, so this is written in bass clef, and you see that it's in 3/4, so the triple meter is a typical meter, and that it is in 3 voices. So that's one of the things with 14th century music, is that by and large it didn't have music that was for more than 3 voices, so it's 3 voices or less. You start to have a 4th voice that's added then in the 15th century as you get into then the beginning of the Renaissance. And one of the main things that you'll see at the beginning of the Renaissance is the interval of the 3rd and 6th, that those intervals are treated as consonant intervals. So in the 14th century, 3rds and 6ths are not treated as consonant. And so it gives it that open kind of sound when you hear it performed. And so you'll have at cadence points, very often it's going to be, a perfect fifth between the lowest voice and, the duplum, the voice above it. And then between that duplum and the triplum, the top 2 voices would be the interval of a perfect fourth. And so it just gives you that, those open intervals of octaves and fourths and fifths. And so you'll hear that when you listen to it. And there's uploaded a recording, a YouTube recording that is under the listening tab on the web page. So 3 voices and perfect intervals. One of the things that you see about the way it's set is that it's very melismatic, meaning that there are, for the majority of the work, many notes per syllable. And it's just at the cadence points that you are going to have then a little bit more, the setting where there's 1 note per syllable is called syllabic. The one where there are just a few notes is called pneumatic. But at any rate, at the cadence points, there are, fewer notes per syllable leading into the cadence. And if you look at the cadence there at the end of that 3rd line, you see that it is a clausula vera, meaning that means true close, meaning that the outer voices move by step into the final, to the last pitch, and the voices move in contrary motion. And so it doesn't have that 5-1 progression that we're going to come to see in the Renaissance, and then becomes the most important type of cadential pattern, the authentic cadence in the tonal era. So as you're listening to this work, you'll see at the end of the first system it changes to 2/4. And so that is one of the characteristics of the Ars Nova, is that shift of meter there. And you see that it continues to do that until the end of that first section, where you have at the end of the 3rd system the thin double bars. At that point then, it does continue in 2/4, and then we've got that for the rest of the work. So this is one that the majority of it is in 2/4. All right. The main thing I want to point out about this work has to do with the way that the text is organized. So if you look at the 2nd page, and just take a moment, you can read through the English translation. Like I said, it's esoteric. If you look at the French, the original language, on the left column, then you'll see the rhyme scheme is just 2 basic syllables that are used to rhyme. And it follows this pattern of A, B, A, B, A, B. So there are 8 lines of text in total, and they would always follow this pattern. So beyond that, there is then, if you look closely at the text, the use of returning lines, exact returns of various, actually 2 lines within this 8-line structure. So that very first line returns as the 4th line, and then it returns as the 7th line. So the rhyme scheme with capital letters indicating an exact repetition of the text I have listed there for you, with 1, 4, and 7 being exactly the same text. You also have the second line of the text returning as the final line of the structure, and what that does is the first 2 lines return as the last 2 lines. And so that idea is, that idea of kind of a refrain is something that's associated with the fixed forms. So you also see this diagrammed there with capital letters and then small case letters. So the capital letters indicate that particular line returning exactly. So all of the capital A's are exactly the same text, as well as the capital B's are the same text, which are different from the capital A. However, the lowercase rhyme with the uppercase version. And so that's how this form is notated. I always thought it was kind of confusing just to read about it in kind of in the abstract, but if you see it associated with this particular poem, and then if you go back and look at the way that this is notated, you'll see that at the beginning you see 1, 4, and 7. And so this particular so that would be number 1, number 4, and number 7. That section, and you just have 2 musical sections. You use the same section for all of the capital A's as well as the lowercase a's that rhyme with the capital A's. That's why you have here on that first section 1, 4, 7 by the same text. And then you have 3 and 5, also using that same musical section. I'll put it to use the first section. Okay, so that's basically the idea here. And yeah, you should listen to a little bit of it. It's a rather extended type of work, and is one which is a little bit foreign to your ear because of the basis of the intervals, and that there's a lot more kind of dissonant sounding passages than you're going to be used to if you haven't listened to this very much. And so, go to listening examples, click on rondeau, and it's the top score